I'm your host, and today we're diving into the foundational years of someone who is, without a doubt, one of modern history's most debated, famous, and controversial figures. Love him or hate him, if you really want to understand the origins of this businessman, TV celebrity, and eventual president of the United States, we've got to look back at the environment that built him. We're going to impartially trace the complete early history of Donald Trump, from his family's very first roots right up to his rise as a young businessman in 1977. So let's kick off this explainer with a pretty fundamental question. How does a global empire actually begin? Does it start with a single immigrant crossing the ocean, seeking a new life? Or does it spark with a rebellious teenager's sheer ambition in the boroughs of New York? Well, the reality is it's a really intricate combination of both. To truly understand the birth of this modern American brand, we have to set the stage and look at the generations that came before him. Why does this matter to us today? Because empires are rarely built in a single lifetime. They're the generational compounding of wealth, ambition, and shifting strategies. And that brings us to our first stop, the roots of the empire. Because the story actually begins way before Donald Trump was even a thought. Back in 1869, his grandfather, Friedrich Trump, was born in Germany. As a teenager, Friedrich immigrated to a rapidly expanding America. And interestingly enough, he didn't build skyscrapers. He actually built his initial wealth running restaurants and lodging during the grueling, muddy days of the Klondike Gold Rush. That historical grit is a huge deal because Friedrich's accumulated wealth literally laid the foundation for the family's future. Then, jumping ahead to the 1930s and 40s, his son, Fred Trump, took that foundation and just massively expanded it through a huge housing boom. So, it's right against this backdrop of generational wealth building that in 1946, Donald John Trump is born in Queens. Now, if you want to define the next generation, you really just need one word: thousands. During the Great Depression and the tough years that followed, Fred Trump hyper-focused on New York City's outer boroughs. His company didn't just build a handful of homes, they developed thousands of affordable residential units. Fred was deeply disciplined. He managed costs like a hawk. And by the 1940s, thanks to those thousands of units, the Trump family was financially secure. So when Donald comes along, he enters a very comfortable life in a booming post-WW2 American economy. He's surrounded by expanding suburbs and a culture increasingly dominated by television. It was an environment basically defined by relentless growth. Okay, let's shift gears now and look at his childhood in our next section: discipline and development. If you asked family members to describe young Donald, they'd use three distinct words: energetic, competitive, and often rebellious. They remember a boy who constantly sought attention and absolutely loved competition. Right out of the gate, he admired strength, confidence, and success. At school, he had this strong personality and an overwhelming desire to stand out. But as he entered adolescence, his parents actually grew pretty concerned. They saw the raw leadership qualities, sure, but they were also really worried about his behavior and just a general lack of discipline. They realized that a major change was absolutely necessary to channel all that immense energy. So at just 13 years old, Donald is sent off to the New York Military Academy. Just imagine that severe culture shock for a second, going from a very comfortable, privileged upbringing in Queens to this uncompromising world of strict schedules, rigorous physical fitness, and intense personal discipline. Literally every hour of the day was dictated for him. At first, it was a massive struggle for the 13-year-old, but here's what's so fascinating. He didn't just survive it. He eventually adapted to and even weaponized this strict environment. He started to excel, heavily participating in sports and taking on student leadership roles. Teachers noticed this incredible, unshakable confidence in him. This academy became one of the absolute most defining influences of his early life, permanently shaping his fiercely competitive, almost combative style. With that strict foundation locked in place, we move to the next phase: education and the family business. After the military academy, Donald wasn't just drifting through higher education like a lot of young students trying to find themselves. He knew exactly what he wanted: the family trade. He spent a couple of years at Fordham University before making a very deliberate move to transfer to the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Finance, which was already recognized as one of America's premier business schools. In 1968, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics. But while he was there, he wasn't just passing classes. He intensely focused his studies on real estate development and the economics of urban growth. He was heavily preparing for the real world. But, classroom theory is only going to get you so far. He needed real-world application. After college, Donald joined his father's company. Working right alongside Fred Trump in Brooklyn and Queens provided an essential, hands-on education. He was right there in the trenches, financing properties, navigating complex and often really tough negotiations with contractors, managing massive construction projects, and most importantly, making deals. He was learning the precise mechanics of middle-income real estate development directly from a master builder. But despite this incredible apprenticeship, Donald's internal ambitions were growing far beyond the outer boroughs of New York. He wanted something much, much bigger. Let's look at the Manhattan vision. Right here is where we see a very clear generational pivot. On one hand, you have Fred Trump's safe, disciplined business model, building middle-income housing out in the boroughs, heavily focused on careful cost management. It was incredibly successful, but it was quiet. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump's vision. He wants prestige, he wants luxury, right in the heart of Manhattan, driven heavily by branding and relentless publicity. Donald wanted the national attention and cultural power that only Manhattan could provide. He didn't just want to construct buildings, he wanted to build an immortalized legacy. However, making that transition to Manhattan wasn't as simple as just buying some land. In the 1970s, New York City was facing profound challenges. Crime rates were soaring to unprecedented levels. Severe economic difficulties were bankrupting the city and impacting neighborhoods everywhere. For most traditional investors, pouring money into large projects in Manhattan seemed incredibly dangerous and far too risky. But where others saw an economic wasteland to avoid, Donald saw a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to capture market share on the cheap and step directly onto the national stage. To execute this, he utilized a very distinct strategy, completely merging real estate with relentless marketing. His approach to building his name was simple but highly effective. Give constant interviews to the press, meticulously network to meet influential figures, and make sure he was seen attending every important high society event. While other developers just focused on the concrete and steel of their buildings and kept the shadows, Donald understood that public image was intrinsically valuable. His goal wasn't just financial success. His goal was ubiquitous recognition of the Trump brand. He wanted everyone in the city to know his name. So put yourself in his shoes in the mid-1970s. How do you actually make that leap? How do you transition from being dismissed as just an outer borough builder's son to becoming a bona fide member of the Manhattan elite? You've got the Ivy League education, you've got the fierce discipline from the military academy, and you're out there networking every single night with politicians, bankers, and high-powered lawyers. But to truly cross that bridge, you still need one massive catalyst. You need a singular milestone project that forces everyone to take you seriously. And that catalyst was the Commodore Hotel. Donald believed New York City was preparing for a massive comeback. And if he could secure the right project at exactly the right moment, everything would change. His relentless networking and negotiating culminated in the specific, massive redevelopment opportunity right next to Grand Central Station. This wasn't just another building. This was the project that launched a relatively unknown, ambitious young businessman into a recognized national brand. It marked the true beginning of the Trump empire as we know it today. So, we've seen how the son of a successful builder in Queens used military discipline, an Ivy League business education, and a completely different vision for marketing to prepare himself for a much larger stage. He now stands right at the threshold of Manhattan real estate dominance. But I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up. How would this young man's ambitious pivot to Manhattan ultimately change the entire landscape of American celebrity and eventually global politics? It's a pivot that brought unparalleled success, but also massive controversy, scrutiny, and fame. And that is exactly what we are going to unpack in part 2. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.
We are tracing the absolute roller coaster journey of Donald Trump's business empire. We're zeroing in on a really fascinating period, from 1977 to 1999, charting an ambitious rise, a near-total financial collapse, and then the incredibly strategic reinvention that followed. Let's just dive right in and break down the mechanics of exactly how this empire was built, how it was nearly lost, and how it was ultimately rebuilt.
So, the central question we really need to explore today is this. How do you actually survive a financial collapse that analysts are predicting will totally end your career? Well, it turns out the answer lies in turning your very name into a brand. To understand how he survived the immense financial turmoil of the 1990s, we have to look really closely at his evolution. We're talking about a shift from a traditional real estate developer into an absolute master of brand identity.
All right, Section 1, Manhattan Real Estate Dreams, Building the Foundation in a Struggling City.
Our timeline kicks off in the late 1970s. Donald Trump was no longer satisfied with just working in his father's shadow. He wanted to become a major figure in Manhattan real estate. And just notice the sheer speed of this early rise. I mean, within a single decade, he negotiated a highly complex deal to transform the failing Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt. Then, he opened the iconic Trump Tower in 1983. And by 1987, he published The Art of the Deal, a book that really cemented his public image as this master negotiator.
Let's look a little closer at the real impact of Trump Tower. Opening its doors in 1983, right on Fifth Avenue, the place was practically designed from the ground up to symbolize luxury, wealth, and prestige. I mean, its golden interiors immediately drew in celebrities, top executives, and wealthy buyers. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just a luxury property, mixing offices, residences, and retail. It was honestly the true birth of a brand, and it established Donald Trump as its very public face.
Moving right along to Section 2, Expansion and the Spotlight, Cultivating the Public Image.
With the overwhelming success of his Manhattan properties, he recognized a crucial dynamic about business growth in the 1980s, and that was publicity. He figured out early on that cultivated public attention could be utilized as a highly effective business tool. He literally viewed it as just as valuable as the real estate itself. By regularly appearing in the media and carefully cultivating this image of immense wealth, his visibility just exploded.
This strategy of highly visible, super ambitious expansion led him straight down to Atlantic City, New Jersey. The city had recently legalized casino gambling, which opened up this massive new market. So he developed Trump Plaza, Trump Castle, and eventually the sprawling Trump Taj Mahal. And the Taj Mahal actually became one of the most expensive casino projects in American history at the time, which, as you can probably guess, generated tremendous publicity.
However, constructing these absolutely enormous luxury and entertainment developments required capital on a completely unprecedented scale. We're talking about massive projects here.
And to fuel all of this rapid, seemingly non-stop growth throughout the 1980s, the empire relied really heavily on taking out substantial loans. It required massive borrowing.
But here is the absolutely crucial point. With all of that tremendous debt came severe financial vulnerabilities. These were massive risks.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 1990s financial crisis, on the brink of collapse.
As the 1990s began, the American economy slowed down, and it created what was essentially a perfect storm. Weakening real estate markets heavily devalued his property assets, and simultaneously, struggling casino revenues started to reduce the vital cash flow that was so desperately needed for daily operations. So, when those two factors collided head-on with his massive outstanding loans, banks grew deeply concerned. Business analysts seriously started to question if his empire could even survive.
The situation was pretty dire. Critics were openly predicting his complete ruin, pointing out that, really for the first time, he faced the very real possibility of losing everything he had spent years building. But rather than just disappearing from public life, he fought back. He entered into these highly public, incredibly difficult negotiations with his creditors to restructure his debt and basically sell off assets just to stay afloat.
That leads us into Section 4, Reinventing the Trump Brand, the strategic pivot to licensing.
A lot of observers viewed this period as the absolute greatest challenge of his career. Yet, he managed to engineer a truly remarkable recovery by completely pivoting his entire business model. Think about it like this. Back in the 80s, his strategy was solely about owning buildings. That meant carrying high financial risk, heavy debt burdens, and massive capital needs. But by the mid-90s, he shifted his focus to licensing the brand. This drastically lowered his financial risk while still keeping his visibility sky high. He was allowing the Trump name to appear on various new developments without actually carrying the debt himself. This strategic shift didn't just rescue his career, it basically reinforced the brand itself. By keeping his core businesses operating through some really intense restructuring and aggressively expanding the licensing of his name, his public profile somehow remained incredibly strong. Actually, his ability to recover from such severe adversity became a major cornerstone of his public image. Many Americans came to view him as a symbol of resilience, the ultimate comeback story. As the 20th century came to a close, his empire certainly looked a lot different, but the brand itself remained powerful. He was still one of the most famous businessmen in America. But an even larger opportunity was right around the corner. Reality television was about to entirely reshape celebrity culture.
He had survived the financial crash, but how exactly would this new medium transform his brand forever? Well, that is the fascinating question we're going to leave you with today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning how the brands all around you are truly built. Today, we're unpacking a truly defining era in modern history. We are looking at that incredible 15-year window, from 2000 to 2015, that took Donald Trump from a celebrity businessman to a formidable political contender. So let's get into it.
Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does a real estate developer become a global political phenomenon? Because, it definitely didn't happen overnight. To answer that, we really have to look at the precise cultural, media, and economic shifts over those 15 years that made this exact trajectory possible. It's kind of like a giant puzzle, and the building blocks are absolutely fascinating.
Section 1. A new media era.
So to really understand this shift, we have to start right at the dawn of the 21st century, the year 2000. The internet was rapidly expanding into our homes, and cable television was absolutely booming, creating this insatiable 24-hour news cycle. And because of that, celebrity culture was becoming more powerful than ever before. Now, long before the massive television fame, there was actually some early political interest. In the late 1980s, he spoke publicly on trade. In the 1990s, he routinely discussed government spending. And right at the turn of the century in 2000, he even briefly explored a presidential campaign with the Reform Party. But, at the time, most observers viewed his political ambitions as highly unlikely.
Moving on to Section 2, the reality TV superstar.
Well, the true turning point actually arrived in 2004 when NBC launched a reality competition series called The Apprentice. And this brilliantly illustrates how almost overnight his public identity shifted entirely. Pre-2004, he was known primarily as a New York real estate developer, right? But post-2004, he evolved into a decisive, global TV personality. The program, which drew literally tens of millions of viewers at its peak, presented him weekly as the ultimate authority figure, someone who rewarded success and punished failure. It took his popularity far beyond traditional business circles and put him straight into millions of American living rooms.
And of course, it gave the world two absolutely inescapable words: "You're fired." Those dramatic boardroom decisions became the highlight of every single episode. It was water cooler television, cementing his status as a complete pop culture icon. Suddenly, countless viewers who previously knew absolutely nothing about commercial real estate recognized him instantly. He wasn't just a builder anymore, he was a certified fixture in mainstream entertainment.
Section 3. Expanding the global brand. Capitalizing heavily on all this new television fame, the company increasingly focused on international licensing agreements. Rather than just building, the strategy really shifted to placing the Trump name on high-profile projects around the globe. The brand became widely synonymous with luxury towers, elite hotels, and golf courses in massive international markets. And here's the thing, while supporters deeply admired these business achievements and critics often questioned the strategies, this sheer volume of licensing ensured one absolutely crucial thing: he remained constantly, unavoidably in the public spotlight.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is Section 4, the shifting political landscape.
So this ever-expanding celebrity brand collided with a profound national mood shift in 2008. As the United States faced one of the worst financial crises since the Great Depression, banks collapsed and the housing market suffered terribly. Millions of Americans faced sudden, severe economic hardship. Looking at this era objectively, these compounding conditions created a massive wave of public frustration directed squarely at political leaders and traditional institutions. Voters just felt let down, and many began actively searching for outsiders, people completely outside the typical political system who promised unconventional change.
By the early 2010s, we start to see a strategic pivot. Sensing this growing dissatisfaction with traditional politics, he became highly vocal. He utilized television, the exact medium he had already completely mastered, to debate trade agreements, immigration, economic competition, and government policies. His comments consistently sparked debate, which in turn generated relentless, widespread media coverage.
Now, this extensive coverage created a really sharp cultural divide. On one hand, supporters heavily praised his willingness to challenge established political norms. They really admired his direct communication style and believed his business background could solve national problems. On the other hand, critics strongly argued that many of his statements were highly divisive. But regardless of the side you took, the undeniable reality of this era was that his influence within political discussions was rapidly growing, and he was building a very loyal following. Which brings us to Section 5, the 2015 presidential announcement.
By 2013 and 2014, political analysts had to start paying much closer attention, and by 2015, speculation had reached an absolute fever pitch. So the crucial point is how these exact stepping stones perfectly aligned over 15 years. You have the early exploration in 2000, the global fame of The Apprentice in 2004, and the dramatically shifted voter mood after the 2008 financial crisis. It all culminated in 2015, when Donald Trump officially declared his candidacy, completely shocking the American political establishment.
The ultimate political outsider had officially entered the race. And unlike most candidates, having never held elected office before, he completely lacked a traditional political resume. Because of this, many established experts and seasoned analysts confidently predicted his campaign would end quickly. I mean, no way he'd last, right? But the reaction on the ground told a completely different story. Supporters immediately celebrated, forming enormous, highly energized crowds at his campaign events. His message was clearly resonating with voters who felt ignored by traditional leaders. Conversely, his critics entirely dismissed his electoral chances. Yet the media coverage became absolutely relentless, fueling his campaign with the exact kind of massive public attention he had spent the last 15 years mastering. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative question. As the ultimate outsider steps onto the 2016 stage, how will this unprecedented media strategy upend modern American politics? He had successfully transformed from a businessman and reality star into a serious, formidable contender. Thank you so much for joining me today on this Explainer. Keep all this crucial context in mind as we dive into the extraordinary 2016 election in Part 4. I honestly can't wait to see you then.
Today, we're stepping back to examine a truly unprecedented era in American political history. When you look at the timeline from 2015 right up to the present day, we are observing a period that completely defied conventional political wisdom and honestly reshaped the national conversation. As we map out this journey together, my goal is to guide us through the historical record with absolute clarity, unpacking this timeline step by step. It really all boils down to one fascinating core question. How exactly did a political outsider reshape American history, not just once, but twice? It's a massive historical puzzle, and to truly understand it, we need to trace the sequence of events directly through the data and the defining moments of the last decade. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. We'll trace the 2016 political upset, unpack the America First agenda, and navigate through conflict and crisis. Then, we'll examine his defeat in 2020, his historic 2024 return, and finally, the Trump legacy. Section 1, the 2016 political upset. From political outsider to president-elect. When Donald Trump first announced his campaign back in June 2015, let's be real, political experts largely dismissed the outsider against a pretty crowded field of seasoned politicians. But defying the skeptics and almost all major polls, he just kept winning state after state, securing the Republican nomination by mid-2016. Ultimately, in November, the businessman and television personality achieved one of the most unexpected victories in American history, winning the Electoral College against Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. So, how did he build that kind of undeniable momentum? Well, instead of traditional political maneuvering, his campaign relied heavily on massive, energetic rallies and a very direct, unfiltered communication style. He captivated voters by focusing relentlessly on a core set of issues: immigration, trade, border security, the revival of manufacturing jobs, and sheer economic growth. Section 2. The America First Agenda. Policy shifts as the 45th president. Right after his January 2017 inauguration, his administration moved immediately to prioritize American economic interests. And two very distinct perspectives emerge regarding the results. On one hand, supporters proudly point to historic, pre-pandemic lows in unemployment and absolutely soaring financial markets, all driven by tax reforms and deregulation. But on the other hand, critics argued that these economic gains were unevenly distributed across the population, and they're quick to point out that government deficits increased during this time. Now, this fierce ideological divide extended directly to the border. Immigration became one of the defining and, without a doubt, most polarizing issues of his administration. Supporters strongly argued his specific measures were essential, stating that they enforced existing laws and strengthened national security. Conversely, opponents heavily criticized the administration's approach, viewing the new policies as overly restrictive and controversial. And, this brilliantly illustrates the exact same dynamic in his approach to global relations. His foreign policy was a stark departure from previous administrations. Supporters viewed his actions, like those historic meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and his contribution to the Abraham Accords, as major, definitive diplomatic wins. Meanwhile, critics heavily questioned the broader America First strategy, particularly his renegotiation of trade agreements and his intense push for global allies to contribute a lot more to collective defense. Section 3. Conflict and Crisis. Impeachment and the Global Pandemic. The latter half of his presidency was marked by some seriously intense political friction, reaching a total boiling point in 2019 when the House of Representatives actually impeached him. Though the Senate ultimately acquitted him, the proceedings laid bare an entirely polarized nation. Supporters firmly argued the process was purely politically motivated, while opponents maintained with equal conviction that the impeachment was a vital, totally necessary constitutional action. And then came 2020. This year stands as a massive, sudden turning point, not just for the administration, but literally for the entire world. The COVID-19 pandemic completely transformed daily life and introduced a wave of unprecedented public health and economic challenges. This pandemic fundamentally tested the administration and completely defined the election year. Supporters highlighted the administration's rapid vaccine development and the massive economic relief deployments that were designed to stabilize the country. Critics, however, pointed a magnifying glass at the early days of the crisis, arguing the federal public health response was, in their view, insufficient or inconsistent. Section 4. Defeat in 2020. A contentious election and its aftermath. Right amidst the pandemic, Trump sought a second term against Joe Biden in a fiercely competitive environment, and the timeline of the aftermath remains one of the most contentious in recent history. Following Biden's win in November, Trump and his supporters aggressively challenged the process, though courts ultimately upheld the certified results. Biden was inaugurated in January 2021, but Trump's political influence? It was far from over. Section 5. The historic 2024 return, securing the White House once more. Usually, presidents quietly step away from the spotlight after a defeat, but Trump's post-presidency was an entirely different story. He maintained an absolute iron grip on the Republican Party, holding massive rallies and aggressively endorsing candidates. Navigating through fierce debates and ongoing legal challenges, he secured the 2024 nomination and ultimately defeated Vice President Kamala Harris. By winning the 2024 election, he achieved a monumental statistical and historical rarity. He became only the second United States president in history to ever serve non-consecutive terms. So, in January 2025, he returns to the White House. To put that into perspective, this creates the incredibly rare historical anomaly of one single individual holding both the title of the 45th and the 47th President of the United States. Section 6. The Trump Legacy. The Impact of an Extraordinary Journey. When you step back and examine the full arc of his life, from a Queens real estate developer to global celebrity to a two-time president, it is by any measure extraordinary. Very few figures have ever generated such intense support and fierce criticism. To really assess his legacy requires looking at this complete, balanced picture. Supporters passionately see a transformational leader who successfully dismantled entrenched political norms for the better. Critics, on the flip side, see a leader whose rhetoric and policies drastically deepen national divisions. But if there is one concluding fact to be drawn from the historical record, it's this. Regardless of perspective, Trump's influence on American politics, media, and public life is simply undeniable. His story remains one of the most consequential political journeys in modern history. Which leaves us with one final, pretty massive thought to consider. As the dust settles and decades pass, how will history ultimately judge this totally unprecedented era of American politics? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I really encourage you to continue exploring the fascinating layers of our political history.